Hello there. Welcome back to A Pebble for Your Shoe. Please like and subscribe if you get a chance to do that. I'm here again with my sister Marie,
Hi.
and we're going to talk about the first five books of Moses and kind of their meaning and do a little paradigm shift of like what most Christians understand it to be versus how Jews understand the first five books. And it's kind of interesting that I want to do this video because now I think about it, we're about to enter into the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, where they say the world began on Rosh Hashanah when God said, "Let there be light." And you've got the Day of Atonement, which is Yom Kippur, which follows after Rosh Hashanah, and then you got the Feast of Tabernacles or Sukkot in Hebrew. And so it's interesting because Jews, I find it interesting to talk about these first five books because we're about to start reading the first five books all over again. Um, Jewish tradition, all over the world, Jews read the same parsha or the same portion of the Torah starting at Rosh Hashanah, and they finish at the end of the year from Genesis all the way to Deuteronomy. At the end of the year, they finish at Deuteronomy. So we're about to end the last book, which is Deuteronomy or Devarim, and start again on Wednesday with Bereshit or Genesis. So I thought that was kind of a cool coincidence that I wanted to talk about this, and we're at Rosh Hashanah. So my question to you, Marie, is: do you think, based on what you know as a Christian, what you've been taught, do you think the five books make a lot of sense as far as their titles? Or what do you think? I shouldn't ask that question. I should ask, what do you think about the titles of all five books that Moses wrote and their significance, based on what you understand as a Christian?
Well, Genesis is the creation of the world and how
Yep,
things began. Exodus is when the Israelites left Egypt and I
yep.
guess wandered through the desert and went to the promised land, I guess. And then Leviticus, it's just a bunch of rules.
Yeah,
And Numbers, it's a bunch of more rules, sort of the same rules, maybe.
numbering the rules.
Uh-huh. And then Deuteronomy, it's almost like Groundhog's Day, where it's the same rules, I guess.
Yep, that's, I think, would you say that's safe to say that's how I think most
Yeah.
Christians in general understand the Torah, the first five books of Moses?
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about each book and break it down. Starting with Genesis, or in Hebrew, it's called Bereshit. And it's called Bereshit because that's the first word in the first chapter and the first verse of that book. So when you go to Genesis 1:1 or Bereshit 1:1, the first word is Bereshit, which means in the beginning. So do you think that makes sense
Yeah.
to call a book that book Genesis?
Yep.
I agree. And in Hebrew, it's the same word in the beginning, Genesis. So that one, I would give that a check for. It makes sense. Now, how about, well, actually, what did he create in the beginning? What do you think
The world
you've
and
learned?
man,
The world, mankind,
animals.
animals. Now, in Hebrew, it's actually, is it really, when you read all the books of all the stories in Genesis, is it just about the world? Is the
No.
thesis about just a man? Or is the thesis about something else that he created in that book?
What I remember is all I remember getting out of Genesis is just the creation, or the big focus was the creation of the world.
Yeah, it's most people, right? Because
Yeah,
that's the title,
yeah.
creation. But do you any other significant stories you can remember about that are in the book of Genesis? What were like the major stories?
Adam and
Adam,
Eve,
Eve.
Abel and Cain,
What about the flood guy?
Noah
Noah.
and his family,
What about,
and then,
well, after that? Babel, maybe? Tower of Babel? All the
yeah,
languages?
yeah.
And after that,
It's Abraham?
Abraham. And that's pretty much Abraham and his family close out that book.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so I would give that a check. What about the next book?
Exodus?
Exodus,
All I get out of that is I just remember them leaving Egypt.
leaving Egypt. Okay. You got the plagues.
Hmm.
You got
Moses
Moses.
and Pharaoh
Pharaoh.
and yeah, the Red
Red
Sea.
Sea, and all the miracles in the desert.
Yeah,
And then finally, Mount Sinai, right?
yeah.
The Ten Commandments.
Yep.
I would say that's pretty good. It's about their exiting and their beginning. Now, in Hebrew, the word is Shemot, which means names. Shem means names, right? And so, does that make sense for that book? Does it seem like it's more than just a book of names? It is, right? And I know the book
Yeah,
starts
yeah.
off with the genealogy of who left Canaan with
Yeah.
Jacob, right?
Yeah, and if you follow the pattern of Bereshit being the first words and then Shemot a bunch of names, then that would make sense.
Mhm.
But then that's where Exodus seems to make more sense because they actually exit. But
Is it really about just their exiting? Or why do the rabbis and Moses call it Shemot rather than exit? It's because it's not just about exiting, the act of exiting,
it's who exits?
it's who exits, right? Because if you think about Shemot, it's the names of those who left, the 600,000 people, 600,000 men, million people who left Egypt. Okay, next book, Leviticus. What do you know about Leviticus? And what do you think of its name? Does it seem like it makes sense for that book?
All I know is Leviticus is a bunch of rules, and then Levi's are priests.
Yep. That's how I think most people understand it. I would agree with that.
So rules for priests.
Rules for priests. Yep. Spot on. So in Hebrew, the word is Vayikra. It's not called Leviticus. Moses didn't call it Leviticus. Moses titled the book Vayikra, because that's actually the first word, the first chapter, and the first sentence. And the first word in that sentence is Vayikra. And Vayikra means to call. And so who's calling? It's God who's calling. And there's a trick to that word. It could have been the word Vayikar, where the A and the R are flipped, but he doesn't employ the word Vayikar. The word Vayikar means to stumble upon or happenstance. Like anyone could have been outside the tent of meeting and stumbled upon God calling them. But it's just the opposite. It's the A where the Aleph is at the end of the word, which means God's inserted his own name into that calling. And he specifically called Moses. When the tent of meeting was built, at the end of Exodus, that's the closing of that story, you've got Moses sitting outside the tent of meeting because the cloud has filled it and no one dares enter because they fear dying.
Mm-hmm.
And so Moses sitting there waiting, and then God calls him. Vayikra. God called to Moses. It's not some priest who was hanging outside or some other Israelite or some alien wandering through. It was God specifically appointing that time and calling Moses to enter into the tent. So it's specific, it's intimate between God and Moses, so that Moses can instruct the Levites. So that's the kind of picture that Moses is painting by starting that whole book with the word Vayikra rather than calling it Leviticus, that God specifically called him. Different paradigm. And then the next book. So does that make sense that he would call it Vayikra instead of Leviticus?
Yeah.
It does, right?
Because it was more of a personal
More
thing.
intimate, personal
yeah.
between God and him, and it's an appointed thing.
Yeah.
What about Numbers? That's the fourth book Moses wrote.
I don't know much about numbers except its budget number.
number
numbers
plates,
of
number of
laws.
gold,
Yeah,
numbers of sheep, numbers of ox, numbers of goats to be slaughtered, where, how, when, right? It seems like a bunch of um, information that you can get lost in, minutia.
Mhm.
So a lot of people skip numbers because it's difficult to read. And it seems like a lot of repetition of what was actually spoken in
Mhm.
Leviticus. But in Hebrew, again, in Hebrew, it's different. Moses didn't call it the book of Numbers. He called it Bamidbar. And Bamidbar means wilderness. It literally translates in the wilderness, God gives these laws. He instructs the entire nation, right? Do you see the difference between
So,
Leviticus and Numbers, or Vayikra and Bamidbar now?
yeah, so the first one, Leviticus, is more directed to the priests.
Yep.
And then the other one, if it's in the wilderness, it's not to the nation or to the people that left Egypt.
Yep. In Vayikra, God specifically called Moses to instruct the priests. So it's Moses talking to the priests. In Bamidbar, it's all of the Israelites, all of the camp of Israel, the men, women, and children, all Egyptians who left with them. He's instructing the whole commonwealth through Moses. So, first book of instructions is to specifically Moses and the priests. The second book, Numbers or Bamidbar, is his instructions to the entire camp while they're in the desert.
So the rules or the laws or the instructions are sort of the same, but not the same, because it's about who is going to actually carry them out.
And who the laws are addressed to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So Leviticus is the laws of the priests, for the priests,
And their actions.
and so
and
how the
stuff.
priests are supposed to judge and watch over the people, whereas Numbers, Bamidbar, are specific laws for all the people. Some are for men, some are for women, some are for children, some are for elderly, some are for the aliens, for the Egyptians who are traveling with them, sojourning. So that's the difference between Numbers and Leviticus. So last book, Deuteronomy. What do you think of that?
That's like Numbers, sort of.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of repetition. So do you like last couple books we've talked about, Leviticus and Numbers, we saw how there's a difference between who it's being addressed to. Do you think Deuteronomy might be another difference? Like what's happening in the third Deuteronomy? In Numbers it talked about what's got go ahead.
Going into the promised land.
Yeah. Numbers that talked about going to the promised land, that's where you get the 10 spies, right? And they sin. And that's where you get the Korach story. And they sin. And so both stories, people are wiped out. A whole generation is wiped out in the desert. And in Deuteronomy, who are the people and what are they about? So are they in the desert anymore, or are they about to go somewhere else?
They're about to go to the promised land, but they're the kids, the people that died.
Yep. So,
but wouldn't they have known?
It's a different audience, right? The parents died in the desert. More than likely, they don't know. They weren't passed, the information wasn't passed on to them. And so, why do we conclude that? It's because Moses is, for a third time, giving instruction.
Mm.
So, if he's giving instruction again, it probably means they didn't receive their instruction in the first place.
Mm.
Otherwise, why would he have to tell them a second time? And so now he's telling this new generation of people who are about to enter into Canaan, not Israel yet. And Moses, before he departs, he wants to make sure they understand the laws and God who wrote the laws so that they can start to develop their own relationship with God before they enter into this land of giants and challenges. So, yeah, it paints a little bit more clearer story. So, would you check off? First book, I would say check. It's correct. It's a good depiction of what's in the book. Shemot, I think, it's better off to check off Shemot rather than Exodus. Because it's not just about exiting, but it's about who exited, right? Bereshit, God created this nation, these people, this family. Shemot, God names them. He took the
He
time
was specific.
to call them and name them and bring them out. And then Vayikra or Leviticus, would you check? I would probably check Vayikra because it's God calling out these people who he named and created. And then Numbers or Bamidbar, I would check Bamidbar, wouldn't you? Because it's where he instructs them, where he leads them, and it's really about the camp of Israel at this point. It's not just the Levites, but it's actually all of the camp. And then Deuteronomy,
Yeah.
kind of check Deuteronomy, but really the big check is Devarim. Because he gives them the words, Devar being the key word, the word is Devar. And so he's writing his words on the hearts of these people as they're about to enter into the promised land.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the whole story. God created a family through Abraham, or a nation through Abraham, and then he names them. He calls them by name. He calls them out. He instructs them, and then in the wilderness, and then he takes them out of the wilderness into the promised land and writes his word on their hearts. Gives you a different paradigm than to just call them Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There's really no relationship, intimacy. You miss the thesis of Moses if you don't know the Hebrew. So, yep. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.